that, we are joined today by two excellent guests. The first one is Rachel Statham, who is a senior research fellow at IPPR Scotland, one of the most prominent think tanks operating in Scotland. Rachel is also the author of our Skills to Grow report, which we released in January, which basically looked at the evidence around individual learning accounts and sort of looked at international examples, etc., and just to come up with some recommendations of how an enhanced ILA scheme could operate in Scotland. I'll let Rachel speak about it in a few minutes. On the practitioner side, we are joined by Tony Elliott, who is Group HR Director for the Robertson Group. The Robertson Group is a very well-known UK-wide large construction company, but with very firm roots in the northeast of Scotland, of course. Tony will be talking a little bit about his experience with skills development within the Robertson Group, but also with some of the challenges from arising from COVID. So the way we want to do this is we'll each speak for a few minutes, and then hopefully we'll open it up for a nice discussion and see if we can combine the sort of public policy elements with the practitioner elements as well, and see how we go. I guess I just wanted to start by explaining why we talk about skills. Why are we talking about skills today in the first place? Well, we know that skills are absolutely crucial to us as individuals, but they're crucial to companies, they're crucial to whole economies as well. We know that the link to productivity is very well researched. Issues like skills mismatch or skills underutilization are very serious problems for economies, and they are quite prevalent in Scotland and the UK as well. But these are issues that are also very important for individual job quality. If you can't use the skills that you have developed throughout your career in your current job, for example, that has impact on your job quality. So I think it is, very, very important that we have the public policy infrastructure in place and that sort of gels with the skills needs of companies, but also with individual skills and individual learners. Now, we also talk about skills because skills are at the heart of the debates we are all currently having about our post-pandemic recovery. And they are also at the heart of any debates we have around the sort of longer term challenges, economic challenges that we face, most of which actually predate COVID. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about that. Now, in the context of COVID, the truth is there's still a lot of uncertainty about. We don't yet know the true impact of COVID on the labor market. We know that the job retention scheme has certainly masked some unemployment, and we'll need to wait and see what happens in the summer. But there's also a different kind of masking going on, which means that this suppressed labor market that we've had just now is masking the impact of a very big change at the turn of the year, which is Brexit, and certainly changes to our immigration system. Now, we know from evidence there's about 500,000 Eastern European workers that have, for example, left the labor market, and it remains to be seen what happens when the labor market starts to recover, how some of these gaps get filled. So we do know that things are a bit uncertain, but there's a few things that we know from past recessions about what is likely to happen. So that's why we, for example, know that young people's prospects are likely to be impacted more. That's why there's a big focus in Scotland, for example, through the young person's guarantee on trying to, I guess, mitigate some of the impacts we know. That being said, we know that in June, there'll be tens of thousands of school leavers that will be released into a very suppressed labor market. And I guess it remains to be seen whether the interventions that policymakers are putting in place will be enough to, find a place for them without jeopardizing their sort of long-term employment prospects. I guess in the context of the sort of longer term challenges, we very often hear about things like Industry 4.0, automation, AI, machine learning, also some other sort of acronyms, all of which very simply point to the fact that our economies are changing, and they are changing very, very fast. And the speed of this change is accelerating, if anything. So if our skills needs are changing, do we have a responsive public policy infrastructure in place that allows these changes to be reflected very, very quickly? And if we don't, what are some of the changes that we need to put in place? And that's some of the things that I hope we can talk about today. Considering all these challenges that I've just described, we at the CIPD talk about sort of addressing three kinds of balance when it comes to public policy. One of these is a balance between the sort of academic and vocational educational routes. We know that certainly in Scotland, but also UK-wide, but Scotland even more so, the balance has been very much in favor of academic education with free higher education, for example. And we really think that policymakers need to look at this balance, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of the sort of very simple prominence of vocational education in the public policy landscape. The other kind of balance we need to look at is the balance between youth and adult skills development. Especially in the context of Industry 4.0 and the sort of fast-paced changes to the economy. I think it goes without saying that if we are looking at a scenario where people no longer have the same career for their entire working lives, and they will need to reskill or upskill as they go along, the prominence of lifelong learning simply has to increase, both in Scotland and in the UK as well. Our investment in education is very much front-loaded at sort of school, college, university, or apprenticeships, but the provision of reskilling, upskilling opportunities is quite poor at the moment. So this is one of those balances that we also talk about. And the third kind of balance that I think needs addressed is the balance between sort of structured formal qualifications, be it degrees or even apprenticeships, and sort of shorter, bite-sized, flexible opportunities, buildable qualifications, etc., which are so important, especially in the context of sort of upskilling and continuous lifelong learning. So I hope these are some of the issues that we will be able to talk about today. The reason why we released our Skills to Grow report in January was so that we can meaningfully contribute to this debate, especially around upskilling. And Rachel will be able to talk about it a little bit more about why we did it, what sort of evidence is, and of course what our recommendations are in the end. Rachel, over to you. Thank you.
Super. Thanks very much, Marek. Thanks for having me. So I've got a slightly unusual tech setup today that's new and being tested after a computer meltdown. So if I'm looking over here, it's because I'm looking at you or rather than straight to the camera. So I'm Rachel Statham from IPPR Scotland. We're Scotland's largest independent think tank, and we're interested in kind of shaping more progressive policy across Scotland. We work cross-party right across the Parliament, and we've been working quite a lot on skills since our conception, which was kind of post-referendum, so over the last 5-6 years now. And then this piece of work particularly obviously is supported by CIPD Scotland, and it's looking at exploring what kind of future options for individual learning accounts or individual training accounts in Scotland could look like, how they could support Scotland's recovery, but also looking back at the challenges that predate COVID, that we know our skill system is going to have to respond to over the next decade, and so making sure any interventions taken now are kind of future-proofed as well. So from the kind of point of 2020, maybe this time last year, maybe minus a month, when we were looking towards the 2020s, without COVID in our minds, there's a kind of key set of challenges that skills supply and demand is going to have to respond to across Scotland and across the UK. And those, some of which Marek's touched on already, include automation and technological change. So IPPR, we've done quite a lot of research on what automation means for kind of the future of our working lives, future of our labour markets. And what we know is that automation is likely to change how we work, but not necessarily to kind of erase kind of large swathes of jobs. So rather than a kind of future where work is, we're kind of in a state of mass worklessness, we're all going to have to adapt, to kind of to work differently. Some tasks that we do currently in our jobs will be, be taken over by, or be enabled or enhanced by new technologies. But that's going to mean that we're going to have a bigger focus on adult learning and on training and retraining throughout our working lives. And we've also, secondly, got the major challenge of Brexit, which obviously is changing, the kind of composition of our economy. New challenges for migration and labour force migration into Scotland, particularly as we have an ageing population, which I'll talk to in a bit. So the new challenges there as businesses look to adapt, and obviously that's kind of compounded by the economic uncertainty we're now facing from the pandemic as well. Thirdly, we've got the climate crisis and the need to rapidly decarbonise our economy, which obviously is going to place a lot of additional demand on the skill system to retrain and to reorientate workers, particularly those in kind of high skilled industries like oil and gas, that play a really important part in Scotland's workforce at the moment. What those transitions from good quality kind of high carbon jobs to good quality low carbon jobs looks like. And then we've got demographic change and ageing population, making sure that our kind of fiscal future is kind of sustained by the skill system, by making sure that we continue to work and earn and progress through their working lives. And then finally, existing inequalities. That's our kind of A to E, looking at where existing economic inequalities that shape Scotland's labour market could either be kind of solidified or kind of pushed up against by skills reform. So looking at engaging with those challenges as we look ahead to kind of the COVID recovery, to make sure that we're not kind of singularly focused to such an extent as we kind of exacerbate those existing challenges rather than kind of rise to meet them. And an important other part of the context that you may be familiar with is that we have considerable challenges in engaging kind of adults with the skill system across Scotland as across the UK. So that kind of gap between younger learners and adult learners that Marek outlined is a really, that's kind of the key challenge across the piece. And UK adult learning rates are lagging behind contemporary European economies. And that's a major challenge that we're going to have to meet, and that the pandemic makes all the more pressing as we see what's likely to be a kind of peak of unemployment in the months ahead. And so we've got that significant disruption to work and training, but it's about this report was looking at how we can kind of rise to that challenge. So what are ILAs, and what role could they have in responding to these challenges is a kind of central question of this piece of work. So ILAs, individual learning accounts, or individual training accounts as they're now called in Scotland, they offer flexible and kind of individualised routes to support learners through their working lives, and through and they can kind of respond to these challenges on multiple fronts at once. So they're a tool to support early career progression, particularly for kind of younger workers who are out of the kind of full-time formal education system, perhaps, but are getting kind of started in their working lives. We can tackle that really important progression challenge that can strengthen Scotland's labour market as a whole. They're an opportunity to learn to work with new technologies, responding to those challenges of automation, technological change. And they're also a means of accessing retraining that can support that smooth transition from high to low carbon industries for workers across the country and across a range of sectors as well. And what we recommend is kind of a built-in adaptability for ILA and ITA kind of delivery in Scotland, so they can be targeted where there's economic need, where there's skills need that's not being met, and also, but they can also kind of play a role in meeting learner needs. So they don't need to be kind of one or the other. It doesn't have to be a kind of binary choice, but they can be flexible enough in how they're delivered that we can, kind of meet those kind of two areas of that they can make a really big difference in, and where we've got particular barriers to skills development at the moment. So back in 2004, the Scottish Government were operating an individual learning account system up until 2017, when it was replaced with an individual training account scheme. A different name, but not, not a kind of massively different approach. Right now, provision is focused on people in work earning £22,000 or under, or in receipt of universal credit or equivalent means tested benefits. So it's a really targeted approach at the moment. And we'll likely to see kind of demand increase, obviously, given the labour market disruption, at the moment over the last year and in the coming months as well. And right now, the offer is £200 towards a training course for learners, and it's targeted at meeting labour market or skills demand. So it's aligned with Scottish Government's labour market strategy. You've got to be taking up a course in one of those kind of curriculum aligned areas. So this includes at the moment agriculture, business, construction, early years and childcare, health and safety, STEM, social care, and transport. So you can see those are kind of the kind of key sectors that the ILAs are trying to meet. And so far, what they've been is an effective tool for stimulating demand for lifelong learning amongst working age adults, so those over 25. And in doing so, they've been, they've successfully extended or reignited engagement with the skills system, but only for a relatively small kind of pool of people. And if we look at the data that is available for kind of take up of individual training accounts, the take up's highest amongst across the central belt, perhaps unsurprisingly, and highest in the construction sector in particular. Although we know that's a slightly old picture given given the massive disruption over the last year, and actually making sure that we have rapid adaptation, as we've seen in Wales particularly, to make sure that people who are out of work or who are furloughed perhaps can take up training opportunities is going to be a really important part of making sure that we maximise the potential of this kind of training intervention. So this piece of work looked across the international context, looked at good practice from elsewhere, places like France, Canada, even Belgium, and look to draw lessons that could be useful for the kind of future of ILAs in Scotland. So what we see across the piece is that generosity is much significantly higher in countries that have a really serious commitment to lifelong learning, and that where these individual learning or training accounts are really kind of making the difference. And that we can have a kind of a set of different approaches. So in Singapore, for instance, there's a very, very flexible offer where there's a kind of primary commitment to building a lifelong learning culture above anything else. Whereas in other contexts, they're kind of matched up to kind of jobs brokerage. So it's very much about moving people into kind of new jobs where there is demand. And the kind of key takeaways in terms of the challenges of ILA provision around employer buy-in. So we know that there's the toss-up between whether it's kind of a learner-led demand or whether you're kind of responding to to employer need. And we think that ILAs in Scotland can do a bit of both. So it can be a tool for upskilling within the workplace, for supporting progression and productivity improvements across businesses and workplaces. But they can also, kind of be part of this kind of wider shift, this kind of lifelong learning revolution that we hear talked about in Scotland a lot. And then there's also challenges around targeting and generosity. We think as a real baseline, there'll need to be a more serious offer, and we'll need to look to lessons from France in particular around how a buildable offer where you kind of accumulate kind of learning credits or kind of access to kind of unlock future training opportunities by engaging with the system in the first place. That kind of unlock, kind of serious kind of career progression opportunities, and kind of incentivize learners to, to engage with the system and to stay engaged with the system as well. So just running through our kind of key recommendations before we open up, to the rest of the discussion. We're talking about ILAs as part of a package of wider reform across Scotland's skills system to meet those core challenges and obviously to meet, the kind of massive uncertainty we're dealing with at the moment. We're talking about ILAs that are buildable, that have greater value as a starting point, and that have use it or lose it funding, so that you can have an entitlement and you can kind of build on that entitlement, as I mentioned, by engaging with the system. We think the Scottish Government should consider how best to incentivise employers to top up ILAs, so how you can kind of through conversations with employers, and I'm sure people have views on what this might look like. How we can make sure that they work for employers, that they're a really useful tool, and that they're a tool for progression that that kind of makes sense from a business perspective as well, and that they're not that we're kind of assuaging fears that we'll be paying for retraining that will take their workers or talent elsewhere. And we think ILA should be supported yeah, wherever possible, by employer buy-in, to really underline that point. They need to be supported by career progression pathways and by sector level buy-in, so that they are responding to skills demand, but that's led by industry voices, not just kind of Scottish Government perspective or strategy alone, particularly as we're going to have to see, a huge amount of, there's going to have to be much more adaptability built into the system over the coming years. And then to be supported by action to boost learner retention and course completion, so that we're getting kind of qualifications at the other side, and making sure there's incentives for learners to stay engaged. And then we also need to be looking to focus on learner need rather than economic need alone, to make sure that we are kind of getting kind of much wider buy-in to the system. So we're getting that kind of cultural shift, where we're refocusing on adult skills that could have really positive benefits across Scotland's economy and skills system. And then finally, they'll need to be online friendly, not least for the times we're living in, but also so they're accessible to a much wider range of learners as well. So I'll stop there. Really looking forward to hearing your views and for talking about the report in more detail. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Tony, we'll come to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Marek. Probably going to cover some ground that's already been covered by Rachel, but what I was asked to look at was the impact on Robertson as an organisation, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a second, but also the wider construction sector within Scotland. So just for some context, Robertson, we are a Stirling-based organisation, or technically we're based in Elgin, and we cover construction and infrastructure services. So we do house building, large-scale building of schools and hospitals, etc. as well, right the way down to laying tarmac on housing estates and building the houses themselves. We also have an FM part who look after facilities management, so actually keep that rolling. Got 3,100 employees, probably a 50-50 split between north of the border and south of the border. Majority of our population in England is based in the FM space. So from a construction perspective, I also sit on the Construction Industry Training Board. Actually, I'm a board trustee for that, and also sit on the Scottish Council, so I wear two hats in that space. I guess for us as an organisation, so we were impacted by what was going on from a COVID perspective right at the original lockdown. It was quite scary that we're actually coming up to the first anniversary of that lockdown. So we were talking in a meeting yesterday about how do you celebrate the fact that you've been locked out of the normal working patterns for a year. During the first lockdown, construction was one of the sectors that the Scottish Government looked at as being non-essential. So that actually had a major impact on us as an organisation, and it meant economic uncertainty for us north of the border, not so much south, although it was curtailed south of the border as well. In that first wave, we had around 900 employees on furlough. It was about a third of our population we actually furloughed, which meant that we actually had to make some quite difficult decisions as an organisation, which I'm sure most people around this virtual table had to make in their organisations as well. Was actually looking at almost keeping the lights on within the organisation, just to make sure we could see through that uncertain period where we weren't 100% sure how long lockdown was going to last, how long this the shutdown of construction was going to go on. So we actually took the decision then to curtail our L&D offering back to those compulsory elements, which meant we looked at things like last year, so 2020 was the first time in my 7 years at Robertson that we haven't taken on any graduates. We didn't have an intern program in the summer, which we would normally have, a quite successful intern program. And we actually looked at pegging back the numbers of apprentices we took into the business as well. And what we looked at is the offering then became actually, how do we keep the lights on in the business? How do we ensure we're ticking the compulsory boxes? And what that also meant from an industry-wide perspective is, so the Construction Industry Training Board, that we're actually pay a levy to the Construction Industry Training Board. So just for fun, we were a double levy payer. So we pay the apprenticeship levy and CIPD levy. And CIPD actually looked to cut back on the offering that they were making as well. Actually pegged back the funding that they were offering. So it was a bit of a double hit on us. And that, I think, has had a major impact on the sector. So as we start to climb out, as Rachel mentioned in the report, as the sector starts to climb out, where it's actually changing nature. So before COVID, we were a sector that was conservative with quite a small c, still quite paper-based, but we're starting to move towards more digitization of site-based workers, using things like iPads. I always tell the story of how we've now got 5 trained drone pilots in our operation, which we would never have had when I joined 7 years ago. So it's actually constantly shifting and changing. It's almost, the COVID situation has set us back on a lot of those changes that we're making, but also it's actually meant that we actually now have a skills shortage. I've been in and around L&D for too long to mention, and we've been talking about the skills shortage, you know, the war for talent since I joined this game in the early 90s, but it seems to have, this has just exacerbated it, so it's actually made the situation worse. The construction industry still kept about, recruited about 70% of the previous year's apprentices. So even during it in 2020, we still kept taking on apprentices. And of the approximately 30,000 apprentices in Scotland, about a third are in construction. So we're actually a sector that's very heavily reliant on new people coming into the sector. Because we are that horrific phrase, an aging sector. So majority of the workforce in the construction sector, our average age, for example, is 42 in our organisation. So we're quite skewed towards that. And there's a piece of work being done that over the next 15 years, there's about 750,000 people are going to actually leave the sector through retirement. And what that means is we are in a situation where we haven't got the throughput coming in at the bottom end, and we're losing at the top end. So it's almost as if the hole in the bath is bigger than the tap can fill it. So what we're looking at is, and I think going through Rachel's paper, but also some reflections internally, but also with CIPD, is starting to look at this retraining element. So actually look to get returners into the sector. So during the recession, so 2008, probably construction climbed out of that recession relatively slowly compared to other industries. Just for context, I worked in financial services, so obviously I was in the sector that caused the financial issues, then moved into a sector that was suffering from it, so it was probably my own fault. But we're actually, construction was still climbing out of that recession in 2014, so we were still struggling to bring people into the sector, attract people into the sector. So I would say the, as Rachel's report mentions also, this would be a good way to start to actually attract younger people into the sector, but also retrainers, as we would horribly call them internally, but also returners. So people who maybe left the sector in 2008 to about 2012, and actually looking to return them back into the sector, but also into us as an organisation. So for us, that's a big piece of what, and as Rachel mentioned, actually, the ILAs are very heavily used in construction, but at the younger end of construction. So actually being able to expand that into this retraining and actually do some work around bringing adult learners back into the organisation. We also have the goal of building Robertson into a learning organisation. So I would say something such as ILAs could actually help that situation. So we can actually begin to get people just hooked into learning. And it's not, learning's not just about, as it's often thought in construction, that I've done my apprenticeship, I'm time served, therefore what else do you need to train me in? So actually starting people to think that there are other skills they could look at, there are other avenues for them to learn. And I think we're having a discussion before the session started. I think in one way, the COVID situation has had a massive impact in the construction sector, but in another way, it's had a good impact because it's meant we've had to modernise incredibly quickly. So suddenly, especially in an office-based environment, suddenly using Teams and Zoom, but also project sharing platforms and things like that, but also in the way we learn. Whereas before construction, people would say, I've had no training this year. And then you would look and have maybe done 10 pieces of e-learning, been in a couple of webinars, been on to a conference, and would say, I've had no training this year because I hadn't physically been in a workshop. And I think that's shifting. So a conversation I had this morning was around how we could utilise things like a digital platform and online learning for even things around site-based training around asbestos management and things like that, which is a really boring subject, but very important subject in construction that we can now utilise new technology for. So anything that the government could support with to upskill the current workforce, but drive it towards new methods of learning would be great for us as a sector, and I think great for us as an industry across Scotland. And just to close, there was a slightly, I'm not sure if it's a worrying, and I'll leave these questions open for Rachel so you can question her on the report, but there was another report done by the IPPR which looked UK-wide, and the report stated that the UK would probably miss its 2015 net zero carbon target because of the lack of skills in the construction sector. So we would suddenly be in a situation where the target that has been set would be missed purely because we don't have the skills within our sector, because we're the ones that are building the new, the net zero buildings, refurbishing buildings, and setting up new heat sources and things like that. So I'll finish, I think, on that cheery note, just to say that if we don't get the skills bit right, we could struggle with some of those really important targets going forward. Okay.
Thank you, Tony. I think we'll open it up to questions just now. So far, we've had some feedback from Barbara, which is an absolutely fair point on the data. All the data and the graphs, etc., are of course in the report, but we appreciate that everybody will have a chance to have a look at that. So we will circulate that afterwards as well, with a big discussion as to whether we should have slides or not slides. We wanted to make this a bit more round table-y, and that's why we did not have slides, but maybe we'll reconsider for next time. If anybody wants to speak up and ask a question, this is your chance. Or if you want to just type a question into the chat, you of course can. I see Colin has unmuted himself. Is that because you want to ask a question?
Yep. Thanks,
Excellent.
Mark.
Let's go for it.
Hi everyone. Tony, it's a question for you, if that's okay. Yeah. A good understanding of the construction industry, and so everything you were saying there very resonated with me.
Yeah, I did see you laughing at some point, so that's rather worrying.
Absolutely, and in one respect, it's probably forced a lot of change.
Yeah,
which is only a good thing, I think, for the construction industry, because in my experience, we're moving away from people traveling all over the country, handing in bits of paper for timesheets, never mind working collaboratively. So you can absolutely understand what the positives are, I think, from coming through this, but also to understand the challenges as well in your industry. But talking more specifically around about skills, do you think it's clear from where you're sitting just now, Tony, about what the skills are going to be required? We can talk about tapping into frameworks and things like that, and talk about there's a skills gap perhaps just now, but is it clear about what those skills look like for where you need to grow capability within your organisation?
Good question. I think we're in a situation where we are on a path that is quite short term at the moment. And I think part of the issues with the construction industry is it moves so quickly and it shifts. So the thing that is the next big thing, you look a year or two down the line and it's no longer the next big thing. I think if I was being brutally honest, I think the pace of change in the skills sector isn't keeping pace with the pace of change within, this sounds the wrong way around, but within the construction sector. So things like offsite manufacturing are becoming really big in the construction sector. So you build a house in a factory somewhere, load it on the back of a truck. So all of a sudden you don't need as many skilled craftsmen on each site. And I think the construction sector is struggling with that at the moment, but the skills sector are also struggling with it. So the constant debate, I'd say, with CIPD is with the college sector around actually picking up the pace on, getting new qualifications signed off, new courses. So actually, we're almost like a step ahead. We have a very low level of people staying in the sector when they've gone through the college sector. So I think we're about 30% actually stay in the sector who do college courses in the construction industry, because they go off and suddenly they look and think, right, it's a wet Tuesday in February and I'm going to make me stand on a building site somewhere, or I can go and get paid exactly the same and work, you know, in Sainsbury's or wherever. So we're losing out to that. We're losing out to the call center industry. So I think it's playing up the modern nature of the skills that are required in the construction sector would work for us. That was a really long way to answer your question, but I think the answer is no. I think we're not on the right track with it. We're not working at the right pace, and we will end up playing catch up, I think, through COVID, because we've gone for the last year and it seems to be stretching into a year and a half with pulling back a lot of the funding, pulling back a lot of the training. So I think we're probably storing a problem up for further down the line.
Yeah, it's a difficult challenge, particularly with, you know, education, and not just within the construction industry, but across industries in terms of trying to educate and bring young people in with a good foundation of skills. But, you know, but the rate just now is that they're coming in and it's already dated.
Yeah.
For what we need, particularly in the, you know, that's my experience of the construction industry. It's good that somebody's gone through that 3-4 year training experience, but actually by the time they come out of it, there's a different expectation and the skills have moved on so quickly that actually a lot of that's great, but it's not applicable anymore.
Yeah, we got very excited in the construction sector around graduate apprenticeship schemes because they're very practical in nature. So for us, that's a great way to do it. You know, we still take in a lot of people, especially in the technical skill sets around things like quantity surveying and planning and things like that into the sector direct from universities. But for us, the graduate apprenticeship schemes, it's a great way to get people with hands-on practical experience, which probably means they're more up to date with the actual realities of being in the sector at the moment. So any combination of those is great for us.
No, I think there's also a balance of the technical skill and also the behavioural skill element, not just within construction, but across industry as well. And I think that's something to consider. And how do we move forward with that? Because, you know, bringing in a younger workforce, there are different requirements. You talked about an ageing workforce as well, Tony, within your industry specifically as well. And, you know, that mindset change of some of those longer term, longer serving employees that like what they've been doing and don't necessarily want to do things differently as well. And so there's a big behavioural skill piece here to enable everyone to get onto the bus, to learn new ways of doing things. How are you finding the behavioural skill challenge?
That is, I guess, will be the same as every industry. We're exactly the same. It's we tend to, you know, we always, as HR professionals, we say, oh, you should recruit for attitude and, you know, and behaviours. But and then what we do is we then look and say, oh, but that person is, you know, is ready baked and they've already got the skills, so we'll bring them in, and then wonder why we then hit problems, you know, in the workplace. So I think you're right. It is that it's being work ready. And I think that's the issue that we have. We do take in a lot of apprentices. We take in a lot of people on some of the government schemes that are set up. So we're looking quite heavily at Kickstart and things like that to actually start to bring more young people into the sector. And it's about a changing attitude. And I mean, I don't know the sectors that people around this table work in, but in construction, it's very closed book. Like, you're very frightened that you're going to train someone and they'll go and leave. Whereas it's suddenly changing that idea that it's for the good of the sector. So that person tends, in construction, people tend to bounce around organizations. I mean, like I say, I worked in financial services and people had been at the company I worked at for 109 years or however long they'd been at that organization and tended to stay there because of just the nature of the work. Whereas in construction, people tend to jump from job to job because of based on the next big site, the next exciting project, and go and work somewhere else, get some different experience. So I think taking that sector-wide approach in skills development, there's a good piece of work. I mean, I'm really bored and hogging it here on construction, but there's a piece that the Construction Scotland Innovation Centre's doing at the moment on portable skills passports. So within Scotland, so one of the Build Back Better pieces in Scotland post-COVID was around portable skills passports for people in the construction sector. So I could go and work for Barrett, or I could go and work for Persimmon or whoever I went to work for, and my portable skills portfolio went with me. So a bit like, I'm old enough to remember in the good old days when you used to have like the YTS schemes, and people had a portfolio that they would bring along, and then you'd fill it in, and they would take that from role to role. So it's actually getting back to that in our sector, where we can then start to say, okay, right, the fact that this person has the skills is a given. Now let's look and see, what are their behaviours like? How have they developed themselves over the years? Have they kept up to speed with things? So it'll actually allow us to start to focus on some of that other stuff.
Can I bring Rachel into this? Because I think one of the things that Colin just mentioned, which was the sort of very fast changing need for skills, which are outdated almost, as soon as somebody has finished a course. Surely that just supports the argument that we are making over a sort of buildable scheme, where you sort of almost build up an entitlement over several years that you can then use against the course that is relevant right there and then. And I mean, you've looked at it as part of the research that you've done. There is a trade-off there between a very simple, here's 200 quid and that's it scheme, and something a bit more complicated, but presumably the trade-off is well worth making.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think even if you look at what will keep learners in the system, I think the reason we've talked about the importance of lifelong learning culture for so long is because we know increasingly our labour market demands people are having to engage more than once, likely to increasingly need to retrain or upskill at more than one point after they leave full-time education, whatever that was. And it's something that offers the kind of flexibility and opens up a kind of relationship with the skill system for a learner, and particularly a learner in work, rather than something coming out of another part of the skill system full time. It kind of has a huge amount of potential, and that those relationships to start with are kind of the core of of the kind of shift we need to see. And obviously we've seen innovation across the kind of FE sector in Scotland, but a lot of that is still people are kind of at the earlier stage of their careers, and that this is going to have to be a kind of an industry-wide kind of shift. It's going to have to take a serious buy-in from employers as well. It's going to have to be a kind of offer from government that makes sense for learners, for employers, and exactly as Tony was saying, for kind of sectors as a whole. So you can see the kind of sector-wide benefits of this sort of investment. And that it makes sense for learners too. It fits around their work lives. It's not something that kind of takes you out of the workforce, but something that kind of opens up kind of doors down the line.
I guess ILAs and apprenticeships and the funding attached to them is very much there to try and sort of stimulate the demand for learning from individual learners. But there's of course the other side of the coin, which is the supply of appropriate training, be it through further education colleges or through any sort of training providers. Tony, would you say that the supply is sufficient, appropriate, correct at the moment, or where do you see changes?
Yeah, I think it's probably just a little, as we said before, it's about trying to keep pace with the changing nature of not only the different sectors, but also the changing nature of how learners learn. And I think that's a piece that can often get missed. And I know the colleges and the college sector are now, they're run as businesses as much as Robertson is run as a business, but at times it can feel as if things are dropped too quickly, or they're not quick enough because they don't see the economic benefit of it now, but the economic benefit to the Scottish economy as a whole, or the actual economic benefit to individual sectors could be huge. So I think, again, it's probably engaging with Scottish Government through bodies like Skills Development Scotland to actually ensure that there's that push towards the college sector actually working much closer with industry. And I think that's the gap that became quite wide during the COVID piece. But I think it's been there for as long as I've been in this sector, which is the actual understanding between the sector and construction. And if there's anyone else from a construction organisation, I apologise in advance, is one of the worst for keeping its own house in order. when it comes to training and development. The reason that there is a construction industry training board is because there's very little collaboration between organisations actually to look at that sector-wide approach. So actually closer working with the college sector, with further education sector, I think would be no bad thing. And it would help us to match the skills need that we have now, but also match the future skills need, because construction, although we tend to build buildings that will last for 60 or 100 years, we'll build it in 18 months to 2 years and then be on to the next thing. So it's quite a short-term sector. Whereas I think the support from the college sector and the support from the further education sector and actually acting as those voices of expertise in some of this would actually help. But training provision is, there's quite a glut of it, but I don't know if that's just an element of COVID, because it's, there's a good provision out there in the construction sector, but it's often finding things that can keep pace with the change that's going
on.
Marek, if I could come in, if you don't mind,
Go.
Just to see if anyone else wants to come in and let us know what sectors they work in, and is what they're hearing resonating in their sector as well. I don't know if anyone is wanting to come in. Everyone's been a bit quiet, but if you do, it'd be great to have you join in the discussion as well.
Yeah, I'm a Geordie. If you leave dead air, I'll just keep filling it.
I think we've got a shy audience.
Sorry, my name's Laura Miller. I'm the people manager at Trees for Life. So we are a conservation charity based in the Highlands. We run a traineeship programme designed to try and get young people specifically into careers that they might not have necessarily considered before. So that's stuff like horticulture, estate management, game management. And we also try and target women and young women particularly to consider work in this sector. Forestry is another big part of what we do. We own a 10,000 acre estate. So there's so many different types of roles within, within trying to manage the charity and the estate as well. We really struggle to try and get people to come up to the Highlands of Scotland. And again, what you were saying about the ageing populations, and particularly in the Northern Highlands, is there's a lack of young people, there's a lack of accommodation, and some days it feels like we're just never going to kind of solve this problem. You know, we can attract young people to want to come and work for us and to volunteer, but there's no way for them to live. They can't afford to live in these areas. And I wondered if anyone else had kind of come across that. We're really lucky, we've got funding, we've got money to pay young people to train them and to give them qualifications and hopefully the start of a career, but that's something we really struggle with. I just wondered if there's anyone else in this area that had come across the same issue. So like Tony, you said you were based in Elgin, which isn't far. We're actually based we're based in Fintorn is our core office. But I wondered if maybe it's different in the construction industry. I don't know.
No, we're exactly the same. I think often, and I don't know if this is the piece with, and maybe it's something for Rachel, but it's that the breakdown of Scotland, and it's, central Scotland is not the Highlands and Islands. And I think often government policy can look at that focus, it's either one or the other. So it's the focus on the central belt or the focus on the Highlands and Islands. So I know CIPD did a piece where all of the funding was going to the Highlands and Islands, and 90% of the construction that was going on was in the central belt. So I'd agree with you, Laura. It's very difficult to attract, especially returners in our Highlands business. So our business, which we would call Northern, is based in Elgin, and they look at from everything from there up over. And sometimes you're talking about really remote locations or building the hospital in Orkney and things like that. So it's a totally different skill set you need in the individual. And our industries change where people used to say, right, I'm off to London for 2 years, I'll see you in a couple of years, and disappear off, whereas young people coming into the industry don't want to do that anymore. You know,
no, we have, the problem we have though is that we have more people wanting to come from England, which is, I'm not trying to be controversial here, but what we actually really want to do is to provide jobs for people in Scotland.
Oh, exactly.
And to try and revitalise the community and to train young Scottish people. But
yep.
It just feels as if you're just coming up to barriers all the time. I mean, we're trying, we have good relationships with things like the colleges, you know, part of the UHI network.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't quite have the flexibility that we do as an employer. They're rigid within their frameworks of how they can deliver and how learners should learn.
Yeah. Whereas
we're a bit more practical and accept that people learn in different ways and try and adapt it. So yeah, it's a challenge, but.
I'll throw a question to you, was it? Because you mentioned about attracting people into the sector just because of the variety of roles that you had. How did you make that a success? Because it's something we've struggled with for years in construction, because people think if you work in construction, you put a high-vis vest and a hard hat on every day, but there's actually more to it than that. So I was just wondering if you got any experience of that.
Well, we offer taster days. So we run taster days on different kind of different areas. So we'll have we normally have 6 trainees a year. We have a forestry trainee, a horticulture, what we call a game and estate manager. We've got a digital trainee now as well. So we're trying to branch out and realise that actually just because we're a conservation charity, we still need people with IT and data and like system skills in order for us to try and progress. And then the last one is we have a community engagement trainee as well. So somebody who can, you know, get out there and meet the local communities and try and build on that relationship. So we normally have about 100 people come on a taster day, and they learn a bit more about what we do and what happens in the average day of a forester. Ours is a bit different because we're not a commercial forester. Instead of cutting down, well, we cut down non-invasive trees, but it's more about replanting and rewilding with native species in the Highlands. So that we get a lot of interest for that, but something happens as soon as they get there. I think they see it's not quite the traditional image of walking around the Highlands, you know, with a big deer in the background, like on the shortbread tins. You know, it's hard living there. You've got to drive, and that's another big thing we find stops young people is they can't afford to learn to drive, or they just don't have access to a car kind of thing. So a lot of challenges, I think, for young people. I do feel for them. But our average age in our organisation is 53, and we're predominantly a white male, I guess you could call a middle class organisation, and we really want to do something to try and change that, but it feels as if the geography kind of works against us sometimes. I don't know if other organisations have that. But yes, that was my question. So thank you very much, Tony, and I'll stop talking now as well.
These are issues that the Scottish government has been grappling with, you know, for years, if not decades. Depopulation of rural areas, etc. It's all linked to things like infrastructure as well, broadband, etc. But you know, if COVID has had some sort of an impact, it will certainly have an impact in this area. You know, there's a lot more discussion currently ongoing about you know, if we are moving to a sort of remote working, or at least some sort of a hybrid model, is that actually going to encourage more people to move even further away from big cities into more rural areas, and you know, and will this result in sort of a longer term shift? Now, I'm aware we have 2 minutes or maybe 1.5 minutes left. I'm not quite sure where the time has gone, because I feel like we've only just started. But if there's anybody else who would like to contribute or ask a question, please speak now. I'm going to take
I've got one final question, Marek, if that's, I've got lots of questions, so, but.
Time for one, I think.
In terms of so if we go back to the kind of publication in terms of the skills, and particularly, there's a big focus on the ITAs, and in terms of how they could be better utilised going forward in terms of broadening that offer. I know that was a paper that was produced, to be able to help to influence Scottish Government. What kind of stage is that at then, and what's the feedback been from that publication?
So we always publish this report with the intention to influence policy rather than to make a big splash in the media or something like that, which is, I think, and sort of turned out exactly the way we hoped, which means that the feedback from the sort of policymaker community has been very positive. And probably the best thing that has happened was that we were asked for a meeting by Jamie Hepburn, who's the Minister for Fair Work and Skills, and it was unprompted. It wasn't even us fishing for a meeting. So they contacted us unprompted to discuss this because they're interested in this area. So we had a good chat with them, discussed some of the sort of practical difficulties. I guess government business right now is entering a sort of period of flux because we're approaching an election, and we'll need to wait and see what the relevant political party manifestos say about ITAs or skills development. But we've spoken to every major political party about this as an idea, and I think they're very receptive to it as well. So I think it's very positive. We're at a good stage. I wouldn't want to make predictions, but I know that government is interested in it, STS is interested in it, and actually the UK government has been talking about this a little bit behind the scenes as well, because after all, the recommendations can apply to any legislature. Actually, it doesn't have to be a Scottish scheme, it could be a UK-wide scheme or an English scheme or an Irish scheme, etc. So I'd say cautiously optimistic, but I will not make any promises, of course.
Thanks, Marek.
Thank you, Colin. Okay, I think on that note, we will probably wrap this up. Thank you all very much for coming and attending. Especially grateful to Tony and Rachel for their time and expertise, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again at some point, and hopefully face to face, which would be lovely. I'll be sick of this screen. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch and